So my boyfriend, his best friend, his girlfriend and I drove up to Big Bear Lake on June 26. The next day, June 27, another friend joined us. The plan was for him to sleep downstairs while the two couples slept upstairs, since the cabin only had 2 bedrooms. The first night felt a little creepy because the cabin was very remote and there were absolutely no lights outside. It was deep into the woods, with coyotes howling and the possibility of bears nearby. Still, all of that was completely normal. On June 27, around midnight, my boyfriend and I were in bed when our friend, who was sleeping downstairs, came pounding on our door in panic. He said he had been seeing shadows moving in the woods, that the motion sensor light had been turned on, and that he heard thumping outside. We were definitely unsettled, but my boyfriend got out of bed and thoroughly checked the cabin. He even went outside. He found nothing. We then went upstairs to the other couple's room. The room had a porch with a sliding glass door overlooking the forest. It's important to mention that I'm naturally very anxious and easily frightened, whereas my boyfriend is calm, logical, and rarely rattled. My boyfriend went to inspect the final area of the cabin. He pulled back the curtains and suddenly jumped back, shouting, "Oh my god." I was instantly terrified. My boyfriend is a 180-pound CrossFit coach, and seeing someone like him genuinely startled was deeply unsettling. He quickly locked the sliding door and slowly backed away. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "There's a large man standing outside, staring at us. He's just standing in the woods, looking at us." At first, I thought he was joking. Then he turned to me and said, "Go lock the door." That was when I realized he was completely serious. Everyone started panicking. I ran to secure the door behind us, and we all decided to stay in that room together so we could keep watch. It was in the middle of summer and the room was extremely hot, but none of us were willing to open a window. Although I was terrified, I tried not to show it, especially as everyone else gradually seemed to calm down. After about 30 minutes with no further activity, I became frustrated with the heat and the fact that 5 people were crammed into a tiny room. So my boyfriend and I returned to our bedroom. I was still badly shaken and he tried to comfort me. By then it was around 1:30 AM. I told him I was too scared to sleep with the lights off. He said it was completely fine, so we left every light in the room on and lay in the bed together. Eventually, I began drifting off to sleep. Then I heard a loud thud. I sat upright and looked at my boyfriend. He looked back at me, and then the power went out. I immediately burst into tears. I was trembling, unable to see anything because the room was now in complete darkness. I tried to jump out of bed and run, but my legs became tangled in the sheets and I fell. My boyfriend picked me up and we grabbed our phones and rushed into the room where everyone else was staying. By this point, I was completely hysterical. I tried contacting our host, but none of my messages would go through. I tried calling my dad, but all of our phones displayed the same message: no service. We were entirely alone in the woods. Thankfully, the friend who had been driven up separately used a different phone carrier and his phone managed to get a bar of signal. He called the local sheriff. At that time, it may have been an overreaction, but we genuinely believed we were in danger. The sheriff transferred us to the utility company. After we gave them the cabin's address, they told us that the property was so remote that they did not service that area. That made things even more unsettling. Now, we were wondering whether the entire area had lost power or whether the man outside somehow cut electricity to the cabin. I cried even harder. Eventually, we called 911 to report both the suspicious person and the unexplained power outage. The fire department was dispatched. Several tense hours passed. At around 3 AM, the power suddenly came back on. Exhausted, we finally fell asleep. The following day, we spoke to some locals. When we told them the power had gone out, one of them said that was highly unusual. According to him, outages in that area typically only occurred during major snowstorms. He had no explanation for what had happened. So to the man in the woods, the one who stood silently outside our cabin and may have cut the power while we slept in the middle of nowhere, let's never meet again. This was back in June 2019. I, 19 at the time, went to visit my best friend, we'll call her Kelly, at her college, UCSC. A few of our hometown friends tagged along, and we stayed at her apartment for a day before our bigger trip down to LA. Kelly, her college friends, and the rest of us rented a minivan and drove 6 hours to West Hollywood. There were 7 of us girls in total, and everything was going very well. We went to the Malibu beach, had breakfast at the Boulevard Hotel, and hiked to the Hollywood sign. Our first 2 nights were joyful, as were our last night, until very late. Before I go on, I'd like to describe the Airbnb. It was in a sketchy area. There was a shed in the backyard that we weren't supposed to go into, surrounded by overgrown plants. A high chain link fence enclosed the property, and we had to enter the padlock code at the driveway gate to get the key. The house was 1 story with 3 bedrooms. There were a glass-windowed front porch where we spent a lot of time hanging out and smoking weed, lol. The back porch was similar but more run down. We kept both back doors locked at all times, along with the driveway gate. I still have the exact address. I found it using Street View on Google Maps, but I won't share it. On our last night, Saturday, we were hanging out on the front porch. Looking back, there was a strange moment that felt like foreshadowing. While we were outside, we heard the padlock and chain jingling at the gate. Thick brush blocked our view, so we couldn't see anything. We all retreated inside for a while, then eventually worked up our courage to go back out and finish the joint. A bunch of us went to bed early, since we had to wake up early to drive back to Santa Cruz. Some of the girls still needed to study for finals. I remember smoking and going to bed at around 11:30 p.m. Another friend, we'll call her Gabby, was the last to go to bed at around 1:30 a.m. Everyone was asleep except Kelly, who stayed awake talking to a crush on FaceTime. I had been asleep for a while when one of the girls woke me up in a frantic state. She pleaded with me to come into the living room because they thought there was something in the house. At first, I was honestly annoyed. I was irritated that they woke me up and couldn't figure it out themselves. I had no idea how desperate the situation felt to them. When I walked into the living room, everyone was there except one girl who was still asleep. From the living room, you couldn't see into the kitchen, which is also where the bathroom is located. I sat down on the couch and everyone started whispering at once, trying to explain what was happening. Still irritated, I said, "If you really think there's something going on, why don't you just call the cops?" Immediately, they all told me to shh, and I stopped talking. For about 5 seconds, I stayed quiet. Then I heard movement in the kitchen. It sounded like someone putting something into the sink or moving cups around. My heart dropped. I jumped out of the couch, faster than I ever had in my life. I gathered all the girls in one bedroom, woke the last girl sleeping. She was extremely annoyed, and I had to be a bit forceful to get her up, and we all took shelter in the other bedroom. We wedged a chair under the door. Another girl and I stood by it, listening and guarding. At that point, we were in a mix of fear, pacing, crying, struggling to breathe, and going completely nonverbal. I was trembling. Kelly was on the phone with the police. Kelly hadn't remembered me going to bed and thought it was me. She called my name twice. That woke Gabby, who came out asking what was going on. The other girls followed. One of them later told me she was hearing spoons rattling, and her voice shook as she described it. At first, they thought it might be an animal. They stood by the kitchen doorway, banged a water bottle against the frame, and yelled to scare it away. It did nothing. That was when they came to wake me. By then, the police were taking a long time to arrive, and all of us were cycling through intense emotions. There were a huge window in the bedroom, and I remember being terrified that whoever or whatever was inside the house would climb through it. The other girl guarding the door looked at me and whispered, "Wait, put your ear and listen." I heard footsteps. I wanted to scream, cry, and throw up. We agreed not to tell the others what we had heard. Eventually, the police arrived, but they couldn't enter until one of us let them in. This created another huge problem, and Kelly argued with the dispatcher while still on the phone. I asked if the officers could simply come to the window because we were too scared to go outside. Finally, the other girl guarding the door gathered the courage to leave the room and let them in. I've had many experiences with police. I lived on a bad block, and this one I'll never forget. The officers were two women. You would think they would understand our fear, but they didn't. They said they had searched the home and saw nothing. They didn't ask questions, they didn't seem cautious. They just wanted to leave. They kept glancing at the weed on the table, as if implying that we were imagining everything because we were high. Some of us didn't even smoke, and those of us who did had smoked around 11 PM. Weed had never affected me or anyone I know like this. We asked whether they had searched the backyard, especially the rundown shed. They hesitated. Y'all didn't search that in the first place, ? The officers left. Kelly turned to us and said, I don't know about y'all, but there's no way I'm sleeping here tonight. I want to leave right now. We all immediately agreed. It was probably around 4 AM. We packed our things and began a 6-hour drive back to Santa Cruz. During the drive, the sun rose. I texted my parents and Kelly messaged the Airbnb host. When the host woke up, she was not helpful, and honestly, I don't know what came of it after that. We stayed in California for 2 more days. Gabby and I spent time at the beach, while the others studied and took their finals, but everything felt strange. It was the only thing we could think about and talk about. At one point, Kelly broke down crying. She had been holding herself together for so long, trying to be the strong one. It was heartbreaking to watch, and we all gathered around and hugged her. Nothing about the experience felt real. Our minds kept trying to find explanations, to piece everything together and make sense of it. On the long drive back to Santa Cruz, one of the girls suggested that maybe it was something supernatural. That felt like a huge stretch, even for someone like me who loves ghost stories. The most reasonable explanation is that a homeless person broke in and enjoyed going through a group of girls' belongings. Our yelling and banging probably didn't scare them away because they may have been high themselves. I often wonder what would have happened if we had walked into the kitchen. If someone had been there, what would we have done? And what if there had been nothing there at all, just empty space? This event consumed my life for a while. Back at home, I became obsessive about making sure all the doors and windows were locked. I checked them 3 times every night. I begged my dad to install a newer alarm system. I kept a baseball bat under my bed. Honestly, these are all precautions we probably should already be taking. But that fear, the inability to fall asleep for months, is something I never want to experience again. This past New Year's was mine and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the 2 of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small, remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading to our cabin. We arrived to find everything snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage. You had to take the stairs on the back side of the property to reach the front door. Inside there was a booklet outlining all of the cabin's information. The booklet explained that during the snowy season, we shouldn't be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear the driveway. Okay, sounds good. We unpacked and realized that neither of us had cell service, but the booklet mentioned that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that evening I had booked us a reservation at a nice restaurant. We were gone almost all day, returning only briefly to get dressed up and head out for dinner. Dinner was great, and we were excited to return to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While we were at dinner, the temperature dropped and it snowed for the first time of that day, coating everything in a fresh new layer of powder. We drove down the private road and reached the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car. He his headlights illuminating the snow in front of us, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly dismiss what he meant, but there they were. Immediately we remembered that the snowplowers might have stopped by, but there was one problem. We could only see the tire tracks because of the fresh snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we returned to the cabin, we would lose cell service. So we decided to drive back into town and message our Airbnb host to ask if they, or perhaps one of their friends, had stopped by the property. We waited in town for a reply, but heard nothing. We could have called, but by then it was after 10 PM, and we didn't want to be bad guests. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that we were overreacting and decided to return to the cabin. After all, I'm really into true crime, creepy subreddits and horror movies, so I figured I was probably psyching myself out. This time, we drove up to the driveway. Near the top of the hill, I noticed something. My stomach dropped. There were footprints in the snow. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look. From what we could tell, someone had driven up the driveway, reversed back down, parked, and then gotten out of the vehicle and walked onto the property. Because we had now driven over the tracks ourselves, we couldn't tell where the footprints ended. The property was large, surrounded by dense trees and bushes. Those footprints could have led anywhere. The moment we saw them, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better to be safe than sorry. Our plan was simply to have officers accompany us onto the property and make sure everything was okay. We drove until we regained cell service, called the police, and waited. When the officers arrived, we followed him back to the cabin. He searched the property and determined no one was there. Obviously, we felt both shaken and deeply embarrassed. We thanked him as he left. Needless to say, neither of us felt like sitting in a hot tub in the middle of dark woods after that. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie, champagneless. Exhausted from the day, we quickly fell asleep on the couch. At 3 AM, we both woke up with the TV still on and every light in the cabin blazing. We laughed about how the evening had not gone as planned. Then, as my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a sound. It was mechanical and lasted only a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 3 in the morning. We had fallen asleep with all the lights on and the cabin had large windows. If someone was outside, they would know we were there, and they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. We crouched inside the cabin, praying for the police to arrive. We were certain that whoever made those cracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noises. As I spoke with the dispatcher, we heard a loud bang on the balcony, as if someone had thrown something onto it. I was losing my absolute shit when the operator told me the police were nearby. Then suddenly, they were there. We saw the flashlights and watched as officers searched the property. Soon there was pounding on the door. It was the police. We were okay. 2 officers stood at the door. One spoke with us, while the other lingered behind, kicking at the snow and examining the ground. I immediately recognized the second officer as the same one who had performed the earlier search. The officers told us that the garage door was not only closed, it was locked. And once again, there were no sign that anyone had been on the property. We considered leaving, but the officers warned that the road conditions were too dangerous to drive in at that hour. I looked at the officer who had been called to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locked every door again, and tried to sleep. The next morning, we packed to leave. Although we had made it through the night, I no longer felt uncomfortable in the cabin. In my mind, it would always be the spooky cabin. As we packed, we heard the exact same sound we heard at 3 AM. Oh, it was the heater. A heater that sounded exactly like a garage door and lasted for the same amount of time. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and walked away, as if. As for the bang on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think about this story often and feel a little embarrassed that so little came out of it, but also incredibly grateful for exactly that reason. But to whoever drove onto the property and walked around in the snow, thank you for triggering every one of my nightmares. Please stay home. And oh yeah, let's not meet. Sometimes the scariest part isn't hearing strange noises in the middle of the night. It's realizing you're alone in a place owned by someone you truly never met. The photos looked perfect, the reviews seemed real, everything felt safe until it didn't. So before you book your next Airbnb, read carefully, check the reviews, research the host, trust your instincts, because not every place is as safe as it appears online. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and a nightmare is the choice of where you stay.